Assalamu alaikum everyone. I am Javeria Sahar and I welcome you all on the behalf of the Department of Political Science, Lahore College for Women University. We have organized this webinar on the topic Hindu nationalism against Muslim community as a part of 100 years celebration of Lahore College for Women University. This webinar is also the part of our department's efforts to equip our students with better conceptual and theoretical understanding and to develop an ability to analyze the things rationally. To begin with, I request our worthy Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. Bushra Mirza, to please inaugurate the session with her welcome note.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm glad to welcome all the participants to the webinars organized by Political Science Department of LCWU. It is part of the series of the event being organized as centennial celebrations of Lahore College for Women University. I appreciate the efforts of all the speakers to create awareness among students about Hindu nationalism against Muslim community, largely in Kashmir. This webinar covers different aspects, constitutional as well as historical perspective of Hindu nationalism, which is reflected in the extreme policy of Indian government. No religion teaches human rights violation, but recently the Citizenship Act and the Reorganization of Kashmiri Act in order to marginalize Muslim community have been condemned by the entire world. These biased policies in the name of Indian secularism expose fundamentalist elements in Indian society like RSS. It also defames the so-called political fabric of India as biggest democracy. The university is committed to empower students with knowledge and skill to become responsible citizens in future. In this connection, the Faculty of Art and Social Sciences is continuing its effort to play its role. I wish that Department of Political Science would flourish to accomplish its targets with collaborative efforts and spirit of constructive engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your gracious words. We are grateful. I am pleased to share that our speakers panel for this webinar consists of eminent scholars from the field and subfield of political science. Our first speaker is Mr. Sajid Mahmood Evan. He holds a PhD in Asian Studies from Quaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. Presently, he is working as Senior Research Fellow at National Institute of Historical and Cultural Research, Center of Excellence, Quaid-e-Azam University. He is also the President of International Association of Historians of Asia.
Honorable Fellows and dear students, in this August month of August, we commemorate the establishment of our homeland, Pakistan, through a series of talks, seminars, conferences, symposia, and colloquia. This time, we are going to have a talk on Hindu nationalism in India against Muslim community. This dictum of nationalism is quite complex. If without going into the genealogy of this concept of nationalism, I hope that all of you will be having fundamental understanding about this issue. So I will be going into the political landscape as per nationalism in India. What basically was the political divide of nationalist discourse? At that time, when Pakistan movement was going on, India was broadly divided into three main streams of nationalism. One was Indian nationalism, second Islamic nationalism, and third Muslim nationalism. This Indian nationalism was being championed by Indian National Congress, Unionist Party, and allies. Secondly, Islamic nationalism was being practiced, followed, and promoted by the Muslim religious parties like Jamaat Islami, Jamiyat Ulama Islam, Jamiyat Ulama Hind, and so on and so forth. Similarly, as a counterforce to both these forces of Indian nationalism and Islamic nationalism, there was a third stream, and that was that of Muslim nationalists as a Muslim nationalism. Now, this idea was coined owned and promoted by the All India Muslim League, which basically was the champion of Muslim rights in India, and basically the founder of two nation theory and all these. Today's talk, I will be dividing into different segments chronologically, right? I mean, I'll be dividing it from 1857 to 1900, then 1900 to 1906, then from 1906 to 1916, and so on and so forth. Focusing on the first period of 1857 to 1900, you will be having in your minds very clearly that this was a period when immediately after the War of Independence, there was initially a leadership crisis, which was basically filled by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. He was the man who got this understanding, that who wrote a book, Causes of the Revolt of India, and highlighted the elements and issues due to which this War of Independence was basically initiated. Having this understanding, he basically conveyed all the Muslims that better you should focus on your education, one, and secondly, you should avoid involving yourself in the political activities, because in this way you will be entangled in that political tussle and you will be losing your interests. Better you focus on your academics. Then was a period when in Banaras, when there was Shakespeare as commissioner of Banaras, and during that time there was a Hindu nationalist leader named as Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He was the man who basically promoted the idea that Persian should be replaced with Hindi as national language. So, therefrom, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan smelt that basically if this Bal Gangadhar Tilak is going to promote this idea, and this will be certainly to oppose the interests of the Muslims and going against the ideology of the Muslims. So he went to Shakespeare, Mr. Shakespeare, I am highly concerned about the interests and rights of the Muslims, as if the Persian is replaced with Hindi, it will be giving a big ideological and emotional damage to the Muslims of India. Shakespeare said, well, so Ahmad Khan, always you were talking about Indian rights. This is for the first time that you are talking about rights of the Muslims only. So Syed Ahmad Khan replied, well, the things which I can see, I think you can't imagine. What I'm saying is that basically Hindus and Muslims will never live together, and Muslims will have to part their ways one day or the other for the protection of their rights. Those will see who will live. This was basically a foresight of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, which he gave, and this basically was the genesis of two nation theory in 1867. And this 1867 marks the year of Hindu-Urdu controversy. This Hindi-Urdu controversy was culminated finally into two nation theory, where Sir Syed Ahmad Khan tried to protect and promote the interests of the Muslims vis-a-vis Hindus. This basically paved a situation where two mainstreams were going on. And since 1898, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, he died, and there was a Muslim leadership crisis. There was no towering personality like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan who could lead Muslims at that critical juncture. Though there was Sir Aga Khan, there was Nawab Bakarul Mulk, there was Nawab Hasanul Mulk, there was Nawab Sir Salimullah, and certain other personalities of this kind. Vis-a-vis, there was again Bal Gangadhar Tilak, there was Firoz Shah Mehta on side of Hindu nationalism, there was Gopal Krishan Gokhale, then there was Dadabhai Naoroji. They were basically promoting the idea of Hindu nationalism or Indian nationalism. So in this situation, it was 1906, which was basically turning point when these leaders, Sir Aga Khan, Nawab Bakarul Mulk, Nawab Hasanul Mulk, and Nawab Sir Salimullah, they decided to establish a separate political party of their own to counter the political moves of Indian National Congress, which was established much earlier in 1885. So in 1906, they decided to establish their own political party in the name of All India Muslim League. And having this party, Muslims started realizing that from the platform of this political party, we can better protect our interests. Herefrom originated basically this divide, that of All India Muslim League on one side, those who were Muslim nationalists vis-a-vis Indian National Congress, which was Indian nationalist, and Islamic nationalists, which I have written as IN, Islamic nationalists or Islamic nationalism. So, custodian of this Muslim nationalism was Quaid-e-Azam Mohammad Yunus, the founder of Pakistan, and champion of Indian nationalism was Gandhi. Obviously, you know that he was the one who basically was against any sort of deviation, and he didn't recognize or realize that Muslims have got their own identity. So they are not minority in India, rather they constitute a nation. According to any definition of the nation, Muslims fall under the category of a nation. So this period lasted from 1906 to 1916. You know, this was a period of turmoil in which in 1909 there were Minto Model reforms where Muslims were granted right of separate electorates. Then in 1916, there were Montego-Chelmsford reforms in which Muslims could get nothing significant. And this was a phase when the First World War was going on, and Muslims were feeling very uncomfortable that if under the pressure of this First World War, Britishers leave India or set it free, what will be the state of Muslims? What will be the future of Muslims? So during this whole phase, they were countering the moves of Indian National Congress and Gandhi, and this was a phase when Khilafat Committee and Khilafat movement started. And during this Khilafat movement, this was a period of highest romance of Indian nationalists and Islamic nationalists. So that was a period when Indian National Congress was having very cordial relations with all the religious parties, and they were going with a joint move for non-cooperation and Khilafat movement and Satyagraha and all these movements. That was a phase when Quaid-e-Azam Mohammad Yunus realized that we should not indulge in such kind of reactionary and agitational politics. Better, Muslims should focus on their own political interests, on their own education, on their own economic benefits. That can only be protected having good relations with the British. And being clear that Indian National Congress, Gandhi, Nehru, and Indian leadership and Hindu leadership, basically, they are promoting Hindu nationalism, which will ultimately be going against the Muslims and the idea of Muslim nationalism. So it was in 1916 when both these parties, Indian National Congress and All India Muslim League, it was for the first time in Indian history that they summoned their annual processions in the same city, that is Lucknow. In 1916, it was all due to the efforts of Quaid-e-Azam Mohammad Yunus that both these parties joined hands, and they had a sort of agreement which is known as Lucknow Pact. It was signed in 1916, in which Congress accepted the right of separate electorates, which was granted to the Muslims under 1909 reforms. So during this phase, this was basically a success and victory of Quaid-e-Azam Mohammad Yunus, that he was able to convince Hindus and Hindu nationalists that just you need to realize that Muslims have got their own states, which they cannot compromise at any cost. So, and then this was a phase when Muslims and Hindus, for the time being, they got positive sort of relationship, and which proved very short-sighted. in 1922 or 23, when this Khilafat movement was over due to the failure of migration movement, which is known popularly as Hijrat movement, where Muslims had to face quite many atrocities, and they realized that, well, Hindus were getting benefit out of this whole Khilafat movement, and Muslims were the ones who were losing on economic terms, on educational terms, on political terms. So, and this was a phase from 1920 to 1924, then when All India Muslim League could not hold even its annual processions. And this was being considered that now Muhammad Ali Jinnah is out of politics, and now All India Muslim League has been exhausted and it will never be revived again. But immediately after this Khilafat movement and Hijrat movement, Qaeda Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he reactivated All India Muslim League, and from 1924 onwards, he reactivated All India Muslim League. Now, running acute shortage of time, we will be moving a little fast, so that we may cover this whole scenario. And that period, basically from 1916 to 1914, was a political tug of war between two leaders. From Muslims, it was Qaeda Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and from Congress, from Hindus, it was Jawaharlal Nehru. So when in 19 reforms were introduced, and it was a practice of British that they used to introduce constitutional reforms after every 10 years. As in 1909, there were Minto-Morley reforms. In 1919, there were Montego-Chelmsford reforms. And in 1929, they were supposed to introduce further constitutional reforms in India. And they thought that since in 1919, there were no significant reforms, so now we should take review of the political situation of India so that we may realize that what kind of constitutional reforms are being demanded and can be granted to the Indians, both Hindus as well as the Muslims. So before introducing these constitutional reforms, they formed a commission in 1927 known as Simon Commission. This Simon Commission was consisting of 7 total members, all were white men, they were British. So it was boycotted by the Indians, jointly both by the Hindus as well as the Muslims. So this commission was received with black flags and with agitation and slogans, "Go back, Simon, Simon, go back," and sort of agitational politics as well, because through the process of this Khilafat movement and Hijra movement, Muslims had also learned this art of agitational politics. And once they rejoined back All India Muslim League, they activated its politics, and they also infused a new spirit in the politics of All India Muslim League. So when this 1927 Simon Commission faced failure, Lord Birkenhead, the then Secretary of State for India, he announced that these Indians are so incompetent and foolish that they neither accept constitutional reforms which we introduce, and nor they are able to have their own agreed upon constitutional formula. Accepting this challenge, Nehru summoned all parties conference, in which Muhammad Ali Jinnah basically he boycotted that all parties conference, in which Nehru report was presented. This Nehru report basically was a reflection, a true reflection of Hindu nationalism, in which they refused that right of separate electorates to the Muslims, which they had accepted in 1916. And this was a big blow to the interests of the Muslims at all. Similarly, they were harping upon that we will be having unitary form of government, which was not at all acceptable to the Muslims, because it was basically against the separate identity of the Muslims. Since Muslims were claiming that we are a separate nation, so we need separate electorates, which was rejected by the Hindus and Congress in the Nehru report. In reaction to the Nehru report in 1929, Muhammad Yunus gave his famous 14 points. These famous 14 points basically chalked out a detailed agenda of the Muslim nationalists that we need federal form of government, we need constitutional reforms, we need separation of sin from Bombay, we need protection of minority rights, and unless and until these 14 points of the Muslims are not considered in the future constitution of India, no constitutional formula will be acceptable to the Muslims and applicable. And if it is not acceptable to the Muslims, it can never be applicable in India. So this was basically a challenge to the British government, and this was announcement of constitutional war against the British. So in this way, when Nehru rejected these 14 points, and eventually British decided to invite roundtable conferences from 1930 to 32. There were 3 rounds of roundtable conferences in 1930, 31, and 32, which all failed due to this deadlock of Muslims and Hindus. So what happened here? Qaid Azam Muhammad Yunus declared that, okay, if you are not going to accept these demands, which he gave in Delhi proposals, very soft demands, when these demands were also rejected by the Congress and particularly by Nehru, Muhammad Yunus declared that, okay, this is parting of the ways. And now you will see that we will never be compromising on any principle lesser than a separate homeland for the Muslims. So in 1940, he got passed a resolution from the platform of All India Muslim League, and that is known as Pakistan Resolution. And that paved the situation for establishment of a separate homeland for the Muslims. And this was a phase in which Muslim nationalists were fighting for their rights under the leadership of Qaid Azam Muhammad Yunus, and Hindus were fighting for their rights under the umbrella of Indian National Congress and leadership of Nehru. So this divide between the Muslims and Hindus basically was reflected in the 1945-46 elections of in India, in which All India Muslim League won a sweeping victory, and it basically proved that parting of the ways, and that election culminated into the genesis of a separate homeland for the Muslims in the name of Pakistan. So precisely this basically was the context in which you can see how Muslims of India had to counter and contest for their rights to counter the moves of Hindu nationalism. And this is how they basically came to the genesis of a separate homeland in the name of Pakistan. So thank you very much. Pakistan Zindabad.
Thank you, Mr. Sajid, for your presentation. You have provided us a detailed historical overview of emergence of nationalism in the political landscape of India and how Muslim leaders tackled Hindu nationalism and fought for the rights of the Muslims. Our second speaker is Dr. Aisha Shazad. She holds a PhD in political science from Lahore College for Women University. She is assistant professor and in charge of the Department of Political Science, Lahore College for Women University. Her research interests are focused on politics of Pakistan and international relations, and she has written extensively on the themes of nationalism and ethnicity.
Thank you, Javeria. I am Dr. Aisha Shazad from Political Science Department, Lahore College for Women University, Lahore. My topic of discussion is Hindu nationalism against Muslim community in India, historical and constitutional perspectives. My discussion substantiates the following research questions. Number 1 is why Indian society suffered religious contentions. And number 2 is why religious identity of Muslim community in heterogeneous Indian state was victimized. Under the historical perspective, I have analyzed the Indian religious contentions in the context of nationalism and South Asian politics. Since the primitive ages, this region remained under dynastic rule. People had loyalties to the single power center. However, with the British invasion of India during mid-19th century, religious and linguistic cleavages became more pronounced. The political elite among Muslims and Hindus got an opportunity to assert for their share in politics. The demand for separate electorate by Indian Muslims was acknowledged under 1909 Minto-Morley reforms. Although these initiatives made the Muslim community politically empowered but triggered communalism in united India. Side by side, promotion of two-nation theory by Muslim League, which was formed in 1906, stimulated identity politics. Another important development in 1925 was the emergence of Hindutva movement led by V.D. Savarkar based on common race, common nation and civilization. Later it was mingled with Hinduism by Hindu nationalists. As far as the constitutional perspective is concerned, the contextual analysis of Indian Constitution 1950 delineates the discriminations against minority rights in terms of political representation. Although it provided educational opportunities to all groups as fundamental human rights and promoted ethnic accommodation through linguistic provisions, henceforth the demand for separate electorates by diverse communities was not addressed. There were various schools of thought in this perspective. Like integrationists perceived that maximum group rights were necessary for inter-ethnic harmony, while the restricted multiculturalists emphasized upon limited rights for minorities and state intervention as mandatory for public good under Article 25 and 26 of the Indian Constitution. Only theoretical provision was given to maintain equality among all cultural or religious groups under Article 29 and 30 of the Constitution. It was considered as a concession for minority groups conferred by state rather than its obligations. In fact, there was normative deficit in Indian Constitution with regard to religious minorities. Then the constitutional perspective of my second research question is that the most critical contention occurred between Muslims and Hindus with respect to Uniform Civil Code in United India. Under these laws, all religious identities had freedom to practice their religion. Soon after 1947 partition of India, Prime Minister Nehru initiated Civil Code for Hindus. Although Muslims, Christians and fire worshippers were also allowed to continue with their personal laws, however, Hindu perceived that other minorities, mainly Muslims, took undue advantage from these laws and violated the spirit of secularism. Whereas the outcomes of Shabanu case 1975 introducing the Bill for Muslim Women Protection on divorce and establishment of board for Muslim minority to facilitate them were opposed by Hindus. It was considered as an assault on secularism in India. In addition to it, Ahmedabad Riots 1985, which continued for 7 months, ignited Hindu-Muslim controversies when Gujarat state decided to enhance the quota for socially and educationally backward classes. Leader of Congress Party and the Chief Minister of Gujarat, Madhavagd Singh, increased the quota from 10% to 28% in governmental and educational institutions. Although these reforms were advantageous for low caste Hindus and other downtrodden population, but Muslim beneficiaries were unbearable for Hindu nationalists. According to Dev Commission of Inquiry 1985, these policy measures were misinterpreted and transformed into communal antagonism to target the state. Furthermore, Hindu extremist organizations like Shiv Sena and their tactics to promote Hinduism while negating the rights of other minorities accentuated religious conflicts. Shiv Sena always denounced preferential rights for minorities. During 1990s, when Bharatiya Janata Party came into power, Muslim population remained insecure. The issue of Barbary Mosque and the biased attitude by right-wing party Shiv Sena against religious minorities created unrest in Indian society. From the last 2 decades, 2000 onwards, Hindu nationalists were apprehensive regarding 370 article in Indian constitution giving special status to Kashmir state. In this backdrop, BJP's hostility towards Muslim population led to its homegrown problem of violent othering of Muslims. Then the series of lockdown in Kashmir since 2019 and other atrocities and recent Citizen Amendment Act are the manifestation of brutalities against Muslims. It proved that Hindutva does not believe in equality of citizenship. While concluding, I must say that secularism as a wide ranging idea largely directs towards acknowledgement of heterogeneity of identity. But under the Indian secularism, Western notion of strict church state separation was not incorporated. However, principled distance between state and religion was established. Political forces in India, like Indian National Congress, advocated the secular nationalism, although time to time utilized the religious sentiments whenever suited to its political ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aisha, for your presentation. You have given us ample food of thought for how can we analyze Hindu nationalism in the context of history, political culture, political identity, and through constitutional design. Our third speaker is Dr. Mariam Azam. She holds a PhD in International Relations from Lahore College for Women University. She is Assistant Professor in the Department of International Relations, Lahore College for Women University. Her research is focused on international relations.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to thank Political Science Department for providing me this opportunity to talk on a very pertinent issue of Indian society, and that is in fact also affecting the Indian overall politics of the region as well. Now, from the past few years, particularly since Narendra Modi he came in power and became the Prime Minister of India, we see that the notion of Hindu nationalism, RSS, Hindutva ideology, it has gained more prominence whenever we are talking about India or Indian society. Now, as we all know that Narendra Modi is a lifetime member of RSS. So this Hindu nationalism and Hindutva ideology, it basically rests on the idea of extremism, that to exclude all other identities. So this concept of exclusionism and othering is embedded within the RSS and within the ideology of Narendra Modi, and eventually we see that in the electoral politics of BJP as well, and when they came in power, this very basic idea of othering and excluding the other identities is prevalent in their practice as well. So, if we identify Hindu nationalism and Hindutva ideology from the lens of extremism, then we see that it has eventually negatively contributed within the Indian society as well, and it has also affected the foreign relations of India, mainly because, as I earlier said, that BJP's central philosophy itself is based on Hindu nationalism, and it has been said as a political offshoot of RSS, and the basic idea of RSS is to establish a Hindu state. Now, even RSS, now it is around 100 years ago when it was found, and that is the reason that it has shaped a part of Indian society and politics on lines of this ultra Hindu nationalism. So this whole ideology of Hindu nationalism, Hindu supremacy, it has been embedded and indoctrinated within a section of Indian society. And we see that the ability of RSS, that they has the ability to mobilize their members on communal issues from the very start. Whether we take the example of a Babri Mosque incident, or Gujarat riots, or the train incident that took place in Godhra in 2002, mainly because we see that they have been able to develop strong linkages through community networking, whether it is school, woman wing, student wing, youth wing, or it is through their morning mediation sessions or their morning marches. And particularly we see that the way they have been able to organize themselves and institutionalize this philosophy through Bharatiya Janata Party. So their inclusion in the electoral politics through Bharatiya Janata Party, it has basically expanded their overall influence in the Indian society, and they have now also a legitimate channel to come in power through, obviously, through the electoral politics. So we see that the overall concept of this Hindu nationalism and Hindutva ideology, it it is it is based on providing providing a thought, basically, that Hindu uh, nationalism, or Hindu itself, is supreme than the other identities, whether it is Sikh community, Muslim community, Christian community, that are living in the Indian society. So if we talk about Hindu nationalism and its indoctrination in Indian society and politics, we see that the major impact it has on Muslims in India. Muslims are around about 14% of the Indian population, and historically, even Muslims have left a strong heritage in India, whether that is governance, art, architecture, poetry. Therefore, with this concept of Hindu supremacy, they want to actually erase the Muslim history and identity, and they negate and do not acknowledge the existence of strong Muslim history and identity which is prevalent in India. Now we can take the example that in December 2019, when India passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, in which particularly Muslims were excluded from giving identity. Therefore, this identity crisis for Muslims resulted in large scale protest in the northeastern India, the capital city as well, and in other major cities of India as well. Therefore, this anti-Muslim slogan itself is a part of whole proliferation of Hindu supremacy and Hindutva ideology. Now, this ideological trend of Hindu nationalism, it has in fact limited the scope of Indian nationalism. For instance, when we talk about cricket, the Indian Muslims who are playing in the Indian side, in the Indian cricket team, the whole idea of winning for India and playing for their own country is their priority. Similarly, when a Hindu is playing in a Pakistani squad, in a Pakistani cricket team, so we used to actually pray for them that he may got the wicket, for example, Dinesh Kaneria, because there we do not see him on the lines of religion, but for us and for them as well, it was the line of nationalism, because the Muslims playing in the Indian cricket squad were playing as Indians, and the Hindu playing in the Pakistani cricket squad was playing as a Pakistani. Therefore, this nationalist feeling, I think, is in fact has been manipulated by BJP and RSS in a sense that India has altogether negatively affected this identity-based diversity that exists in India. And we see that in the past, India used to cherish for being the largest democracy or for the democratic norms, but it has altogether exposed the reality that exists in the Indian society. Therefore, this denial of Muslim identity and Muslim identity representation in India, it has altogether, what we can say, has exposed this cultural reconstruction which BJP is up to, and it has a negative sociological and psychological impact on the Muslims that are living in India. The very basic thought that we are questioned on our nationality, on our patriotism towards the country, and the denial of identity and its representation, it itself is quite disturbing, and it has a psychological trauma that is attached to it. Besides this, we see that this Hindu nationalist ideology, it also has implications on India's foreign policy as well. And as far as the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution is linked, it has major repercussions for in the illegal Indian occupation of Jammu Kashmir, and it has transformed into an identity crisis, as Kashmiri people cannot have their own flag, constitution, and freedom to legislate. Moreover, we see that as far as India's relationship with Pakistan is concerned, there's a series of hardline approach towards having any kind of reconciliation or dialogue with Pakistan as well. Moreover, we see that within this ideological doctrine, the expansionist tendency, they support this idea of expansionism within its foreign policy as well. The expansionism of Hindu nationalism across the borders as well, whether particularly in Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh. Moreover, we see that overall, I think that this Hindu nationalism will eventually have more space for conflict rather than reconciliation or peace. And we see that with the passage of time, even in the as far as the external relations of India is concerned, conflict, whether it is conflict with China or whether it is the existing conflict with Pakistan, it has moved towards more, you can say, escalation rather than reconciliation or any dialogue. So therefore, I think that overall this ideology of RSS being replicated by BJP in this government has negatively contributed as far as the Indian society is concerned and in Indian overall image in international relations is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mariam, for your presentation. You have provided us a succinct understanding of how the BJP government has tried to build nationalism on the basis of identity politics and its impact on the institutions of Indian state, Indian society, and the overall politics of the region. And our last speaker for today's webinar is Dr. Mohammad Yunus. He holds a PhD in political science from the School of Public Administration, Huaizhong University of Science and Technology, China. He is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, FC University, and his research interests are focused on federalism, democracy, politics of Pakistan, and international organizations.
Hello everyone, this is Dr. Yunus, an Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science, Foreman Christian College, a chartered university. In this talk, I'm going to explain the Hindu nationalism promoted by BJP and its impact on the Indian polity and how it has played out in the Indian occupied Kashmir, especially after the revocation of Article 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution. To begin with, India, some 2 decades ago, was considered and commended as one of the most successful democracies in the developing world, whose fundamental governing philosophy was secularism. During that time, the minorities, especially the religious minorities, were living somewhat peacefully. They were enjoying their constitutional rights, and they also felt secured. They considered themselves the equal citizens of India. But then a new phenomena started there with the emergence of BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party, whose basic aim is to turn India into a Hindu country, and whose basic governing philosophy is not secularism. Though BJP came to power for the first time in 1990s with Atal Bihari Vajpayee as the prime minister, but he was not as extremist as Modi is. Under him, the minorities were not as vulnerable as they are now. But when Modi became the Prime Minister of India for the first time in 2014, the situation started changing. Though during his early period, he promised to bring economic turnaround in India. He promised to distribute the benefits of economic development to all the citizens of India. But when he failed to deliver on his promises, he changed his agenda and he resorted to communal politics. He tried to promote nationalism, Hindu nationalism in India, based on the hatred towards minorities, especially Muslim. And as a result of that nationalist agenda, the Muslims suffered particularly. There were instances of killing the innocent Muslims in different parts of India, especially in those areas where the Hindus were in absolute majority and complete dominance. Many of the Muslims were beaten up, and some of them were beaten to death for allegedly keeping some quantity of beef with them. And then many of the Muslims were denied their fundamental citizenship rights, especially in Assam. A law was passed whereby Muslims were required to give the proof of their citizenship of India. Muslims reacted to this law quite strongly, and somehow they were able to achieve some of their rights there in Assam as well. Then Modi turned his attention to Kashmir, which was the only Muslim majority area ruled by the Muslims. First of all, he tried to grab political power in Kashmir through elections by forging some alliances with regional political parties. But he failed completely there. Then he resorted to the negative politics and he decided to take the extreme step by revoking Article 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution through a presidential order. Article 370 and 35A were included into the Indian Constitution during 1950s, of course through presidential order, and initially they were made the part of the transitory provisions of the Indian Constitution. But later on, the Supreme Court of India, in its judgment, declared them to be the permanent articles of the Indian Constitution, and if there was a need to amend them or to revoke them, prior permission of the Kashmir Legislative Assembly was required. But when it was finally done through the presidential order, the Kashmir Legislative Assembly was not consulted. Article 370 awarded Kashmir a unique status where the Kashmir was granted a complete internal autonomy. The Kashmiri government had the power over all the matters concerning the Kashmir except for the defense, foreign affairs, and communication. And the Kashmir was also granted its own flag, whereas under Article 35A, the Legislative Assembly of Kashmir was granted a special power to enact laws regarding the permanent residents of Kashmir, because the permanent resident of Kashmir enjoyed some special rights. Only they had the right to buy land and immovable property in Kashmir. Only they could get the official jobs in Kashmir, and the scholarships for the higher education were reserved only for the permanent residents of the Kashmir under Article 35A. But when Article 35A was abrogated, then the Indian government was at liberty to implant Hindus from different parts of India in Kashmir. In this way, it is still trying actually to change the demographic composition of Kashmir. Its aim is to turn Muslims of Kashmir into minority there. Actually, Indian government has actually borrowed this strategy from Israel, who has very successfully applied it in Palestine. So when these two articles were revoked on 5th of August 2019, a new law was also passed by the Indian Parliament to divide Indian occupied Kashmir into two parts, one Ladakh, other Jammu and Kashmir. And both these two parts or the territories were made the integral part of the Indian Union, and their special status was withdrawn. The people of Kashmir reacted to this decision very strongly. They took to the streets in huge numbers. There were protests all around. There were clashes between the Kashmiris and the Indian security forces. But finally, curfew was imposed, whereby the Kashmiri people were detained into their houses. The whole of the Kashmir was turned into a jail. Communication channels were cut off. Internet facilities were shut down. There was complete media blackout. International observers were not allowed to visit Kashmir. Actually, for so many days, there was no information coming out from Kashmir. and the Indian government uh, tried to hide every bit of information from the Kashmir, and instead it claimed that there was peace, order, and normalcy there in Kashmir. Pakistan, on the other hand, condemned this undemocratic and unconstitutional act of Indian government. The Prime Minister of Pakistan talked to many of the world leaders, tried to warn them of the impending crisis that can turn into a great danger for the peace and stability of South Asia. Pakistan raised this issue at different international forums, tried to share its concern with the notable representatives of the international community, but the reaction from the international community was not as strong as Pakistan expected. Though there were protests in different parts of the world, but powerful countries of the world, they remained somewhat neutral. They did not pressurize India to withdraw its cruel acts. So the India got emboldened, did not change its policy. Rather, its action became severer after every passing day, and the situation of fundamental rights in Kashmir, which was already very bad, became worst. Pakistan tried its best, advocated the cause of Kashmir all around the world, tried to remind the world community and especially United Nations that they have promised to give the people of Kashmir their right of self-determination. Actually, Kashmir issue has been there unresolved on the agenda of Security Council for 70 years or so, but the world community has failed to perform its responsibility effectively. Though the Pakistan have been trying, is still trying to get this right for the people of Kashmir. Then the people of Kashmir have also not lost hope. They have been rendering sacrifices. They have been laying down their lives. They have been actually struggling very hard to achieve that goal, but the goal still seems to be far away. And in the present circumstances, where the international community has become somewhat indifferent to the problems of the people of Kashmir, only a miracle can get them their right of self-determination. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yunus, for your wonderful presentation. You have provided us a basic understanding of ground realities of what is happening in the Indian occupied Kashmir. And towards the end of the webinar, I request our respectable Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Professor Dr. Mohammad Afzal, to please share his thoughts.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. It's my pleasure to be a part of this webinar with regard to 100-year celebration of LCWU. Thanks to all speakers for giving their valuable views about Hindu nationalism against Muslim in India. There is no doubt that the Indian government is involved in severe violation and violence of human rights under the camouflage of democracy. According to international law, all UN member states are responsible for the protection of minorities, but the present BJP government remained prejudiced towards minorities, largely Muslims. In this connection, the university is committed to create awareness among students about the Kashmir issue, Kashmir cause, and autocracies, violence against Muslim community living in India. The Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, Lahore College for Women, University Lahore, has always tried its best to play a constructive role for the development of reasoning among students. This webinar is the part of that continuous effort. I am very much hopeful that we will move ahead with more energy and vigor under the kind leadership of Professor Dr. Bushra Mirza to make Lahore College for Women, University Lahore a great institution for the development of women in Pakistan. Thank you.